Greetings, this is Tim Selden, President of the Montessori Foundation, and I'm pleased to share with you my colleague, Dr. Michael Dorer. Michael is a senior consultant at the Montessori Foundation. He's a longtime Montessori elementary educator, director of elementary Montessori teacher education for many years. So first at St. Catherine's University in St. Paul, Minnesota, and later Winchester University in Salt Lake City, and he is the author of a brand new book called The Deep Well of Time. And today you're going to be talking to us, Michael, about the importance of storytelling in Montessori. So let me turn it over to you, Michael.
All right, thank you. And as you have questions, as questions come up, go ahead and register those because then Tim can share them with me and I'll be able to deal with them or comments, thoughts, ideas. Uh, I'm really glad to see you all, at least virtually, to be here with you again. I want to tell you a story. Once upon a time, long, long ago, long before you were born, even before your parents or grandparents were born, far, far back in the mists of time, I want to take you to a campfire where an ancient Pleistocene shaman sat. And there he was completely surrounded by attentive tribespeople, members of his tribe, young people, women, men, and the elderly. He looked at all of those people around him and he caught their eyes one at a time. And then, with a mysterious look and a commanding voice, he began to speak. And he told the story of the great hunt. Or maybe not. Maybe he told the story of how the tribe came to have traditions and why some things are taboo. Or maybe he told the story of some great event. Or possibly he told the story of a hero, someone who was wonderful in their tribe. He may have told the story of his own youth. But you know what? These stories, maybe 60,000 years ago, are our heritage. They are the heritage of all human beings today. We began to speak as a people, humans, somewhere between 60 to 100,000 years ago. Nobody knows for sure because words don't leave fossils. But somewhere, people began to speak. However, we didn't begin to read and write until only about 5.5 to 6,000 years ago. So for the intervening 55 to 75,000 years, our communication was oral. So how did we pass on news of the hunt, news of the heroes, the great things that happened, warnings against enemies, the rules of our tribe and our people? Well, stories. And the thing that's important about all this is that means they're hardwired in us. Our ability to hear a story, to latch into a story, to learn from a story, is much more deeply ingrained in us than literacy. Literacy is an invention human beings came up with, and is a great invention. But as I said, only a few thousand years ago. Whereas storytelling goes back beyond count. And so for that reason, and a lot others, we're going to talk about storytelling today. And we're going to talk about storytelling in the school, and we're going to talk about how you can create a story-centered school and what that means. Now, this week is the first section of a two-part series on storytelling, so we won't get through everything today. Next week, I will be joining Tim in Sarasota, and we'll broadcast together the second half of this, and we'll talk about stories some more. This that I'm talking about is based on the book that Tim referred to, The Deep Well of Time, The Transformative Power of Storytelling in the Classroom. So what I'm telling you, if you'd like more information or deeper information or something more permanent, look in the book because you'll find many of the things that I'm referring to as we go through everything here. So let's talk about what storytelling is. I think we need to understand that there are some things that storytelling is and isn't. For example, it is not reading aloud. That's a wonderful activity, but it's a different activity. Storytelling is an oral medium. It's talking. It uses language. Now, that language incorporates gesture, facial expressions, movement. It can literally call to mind an actor on a stage. But the storyteller is telling something, and it may be in character, just like an actor. The storyteller may take up a character. Stories offer narratives, and some people use those two words to mean the same thing, narrative and story. But they can be personal, they can be factual, they can be fictional, they can be imaginative, they can be mythological or legendary, or all of these things mixed up. In other words, story is a really big basket that holds all sorts of possibilities. In the book, I refer to it as a bucket that can go into a well of time and pull back the past for us. And this bucket or container of story can contain any sort of things. Now, when we tell stories, you're going to see that the teller, the storyteller, may embellish the story, may improvise the story, or they may stay fairly close to a text. But story is not a memorized recitation. It's a different thing. Again, learning to recite things from memory is an admirable skill. It's a good thing, but it's not storytelling. So storytelling is somewhat spontaneous, somewhat, or might be completely spontaneous, somewhat off the cuff. So we're going to stick to an idea when we tell a story, but we're going to be able to riff on it, as they might say in music. We're going to be able to play with it a little bit. And because of that, every single time a skilled storyteller tells a story, it may be a little bit different. It isn't going to be like reading a text over and over. That's a big difference. And finally, what I tried to tell you in the beginning with my story of the Pleistocene shaman, it's universal. It has existed around the world in every culture. There are no cultures that are known to have not had storytelling. There are cultures that don't have reading, that don't have alphabets, that haven't discovered literacy. There are cultures that haven't discovered all sorts of different things or use things differently, but storytelling is universal. It's everywhere. And in some places, particularly indigenous cultures, it has risen to a high art. And we can do that ourselves in our schools. Most importantly, I want to tell you something. Storytelling is a spiritual act. Now, when I started in storytelling 30 years ago, I did not think it was spiritual. In fact, I thought it was kind of, well, hokey, to use a slang word, not serious. I thought it might be fluff. I mean, let's get to the meat and potatoes of our curriculum. Let's get to the 3 R's. Let's get the kids' hands on the work, and enough with this storytelling stuff. But I was wrong, and I learned that as I interacted with the children. Storytelling is more than transmitting information. It enriches the spirit of the teller and of the listener. Storytelling, by its very nature, is an act of communion, of joining. It joins people. You cannot have the true act of storytelling in an empty room. You can practice. You can talk to a mirror. You can talk to a tape recorder. I've done all of those things. But that's not the real thing. That's a lead up. And you also can't listen to a story without being told the story. So what I'm saying is the listener and the teller are part of a dynamic pair. They interact with each other, and a spiritual bond of trust is formed between you as the teller and the children as the listeners. And that bond of trust doesn't only extend to the story, but it goes way beyond that to the entire classroom, the lesson, the environment, and ultimately your relationship and eventually the school itself. That's how powerful this thing is. So stories are beyond information. I want you to think of that. Information is good. We want to know that. And if you think of it, information is one of the stages of our development as a human being. We have the stage of formation, we have the stage of information, and in the elementary school particularly, we have the stage of transformation. And stories assist in the transformation of the human being. But interestingly, they assist in your transformation as an adult, your spiritual transformation. And isn't that what we talk about in Montessori for teachers? So, if you think, Michael, you are really crazy for storytelling, you've gone over the top, you're nuts about storytelling. Yeah, that's right. I am crazy for storytelling, and I'll admit it right here. And you know why? Because of all the things I've said, and furthermore, it works. Let's talk about some of the reasons we use stories. I coined a term called the gift of the memorable. And here's what I think. When you and I work in a classroom with children, when we work in a homeschool with children, when we're in a daycare center, when we're in an extended day, when we're at home with our own children or grandchildren, we are giving them a gift. And those gifts that we give them are of different kinds. Now let's just think. Some of the gifts you've received from your teachers and have been things maybe like how to read, the sounds of letters, the multiplication table, the shapes of numerals. But I would say many of those things, though we know the outcome, we no longer really recall the process of learning each of those different things. The process was subsumed somehow. Those were not memorable. I want to posit this idea that we have a duty as adults who work with children to give them memorable experiences. We need to sprinkle the life in school with things that are powerful, that are memorable, that stick with them. Now, yes, you could say the multiplication tables did stick with them, but a powerful memory usually falls into two categories. One is the wonderful things, something wonderful that happened in school that you can attach to and think, I remember the time that I was able to, you fill in the blank, something wonderful that happened. The other kind of thing we often remember is the terrible, things that were awful. When the teacher treated you wrongly, when you were unfared against or felt pain. You see, our duty is to emphasize that first kind of thing. We want to give children the gift of the wonderful. We want to give them these things, and those are going to be sparkling gems. They're not the everyday meat and potatoes of daily life. They are the sparkling pieces that they can look back at. That's embedded in story. Story can do that. That's a wonderful gift of story. If we had no other purpose, I'd say that idea that we can give children this gift, wow, it's wonderful. Now, so there's some other things I've listed. We use stories because of holism. In Montessori, we want to give a picture of the whole. What's the biggest thing we can look at? I want to talk to you about the universe, about 15 billion years of history. But I cannot bring that in and put it on the floor in our classroom. I can't take those 15 billion years and wrap them up in card material and set them on a shelf. How can I give it to children? How can I package it so that we can give this gift to children? And the answer is story. Some things are so large or so amorphous or so difficult to grasp or so unique that they may somehow be beyond comprehension. But story gives us a tool, a holistic tool. Now, there's a second thing. There's several more, but a second one that I have is that it gives the skill of listening. Listening is one of the language arts. And in storytelling, listening is enhanced. So it's an important thing because from listening comes self-expression. Once children can listen and incorporate the ideas into their own being, then they can express those ideas through their own understanding and in their own words. And that leads to the next thing, which is literacy. Literacy actually can be connected to storytelling. It's not totally separate, though I may have given that impression. But literacy can be directly connected to it. And wow, we can gain then in the elements of literacy like writing, reading, interpretation of character, comprehension. These have their roots in storytelling. The next one you know that I'm going to talk about, which is engaging the imagination. It almost goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. Stories engage the imagination, and they do more than that. They encourage the imagination. They develop, they help grow the imagination. So imagination is a funny thing. It isn't something that you just turn on or off. Every time it's turned on, it grows bigger. It is a growing, living thing. And that's one of the gifts of the memorable that we can give to children, is the gift of the growth of their imagination. It's also possible in schools to stifle imagination. And you know that's not what we want to do. And then I want to talk about creativity, because creativity and imagination are joined. And they're very important things. Nowadays, in our study of higher order thinking, I talked about this a couple weeks ago, the highest order of thinking is called creativity. Yes, we want children, don't we, to be creative. And that means they're not only going to hear a story, but as they hear that story, they're going to create within their minds a picture of the characters, the beings, the plot. It's there, but it's only in words. So all of that creativity happens within themselves. And they are, back to the shaman that I talked about, a tremendously effective way of passing on culture. And that tradition is the 60,000-year tradition that I talked about. But, there's a bigger reason, a final reason that we tell stories. And maybe the biggest of all, and that is children absolutely love them. If we had this wonderful tool, but it was painful, well, that would be terrible. The good news is it's not. It's joyful. It's exciting. It's fun. And frequently, when I go to schools, I'm just thinking of going to Paul Epstein's school, where I was brought in as a storyteller. And I came into a class and children were saying, "He's going to tell us stories. We're going to hear stories." I've never heard children have that same attitude when he's going to tell us the math facts. I believe in that. I believe in teaching the math facts, the sounds of letters and so on. But that enthusiasm in stories is infectious. It's delightful. And you know what? Because children love them, you will love them too. Because of that spiritual bond that we create when we have that um, bond of love between the guide and the children. This helps. It strengthens that very bond. All right. So enough talk for a while. Let's tell a story. Now I'll tell you this story. When I tell a story in the classroom, I do this. First of all, I have the children to whom I'm going to give the story. I have them gather. And then they know that I will turn my back to them and take a deep breath and gather my thoughts. And sometimes it needs to help for me to get into character. Then I have a tiny little bell or some device there. And when the room is ready, when I feel it's ready and when I'm ready, which may be 3 or 4 seconds, ding, I ring that little bell, and then I turn around and I begin the story. Now this is a story that's an arithmetic story called The Four Strange Brothers. And by the way, you'll notice that little well, the picture of the well up there in the book. Every time there's a story, that icon shows up to indicate we're not talking about stories anymore, but we're going to tell the story. So that's why I used it. This story came about, like a lot of mine do, because I was thinking of the basic operations in arithmetic. And I was thinking, I wonder how I could make those into some sort of a more of a story basis. How could I reach that? When we're working with the golden bead material, one of our basic ideas, in fact, I would say the direct aim, is for children to have a foundational understanding of the meaning, to understand the meaning of addition, the meaning of multiplication, the meaning of subtraction, and the meaning of division. Not to be fluent in using it, but to have this idea of what does it mean to add? What does that mean? And with that understanding, which is holistic, then they can proceed to the detail of actually adding and memorizing and so on. So that's what I was dealing with, was how am I going to get that? And with that, I came up with this story of the Four Strange Brothers. Long ago, in a faraway land, there was a small village. Now, near that village, there lived a family. And in that family, there were 4 brothers. And everyone thought they were very strange. You may think so, too, in a few moments. Oh, yes, they did things that all of the villagers looked at them and wondered about. Why could they live like that? For example, the oldest brother dressed entirely in red all of the time. Yes, his hat was red, his shirt was red, even his shoes were red. And on his chest and on his hat, he wore this interesting symbol that was embroidered, this red symbol. Now, he had a funny characteristic. He always liked to get things and put them together into piles. Oh, yes. He would find apples, for instance, and he'd think, well, here are 3 apples and 4 apples and 2 more apples, and that makes 9 apples. And then he'd find needles. When his mother's sewing kit, 2 needles and 3 more needles, I'll put them together in a pile and have 5 needles. He might even put together apples and oranges, which some people think you can't do. 3 apples and 5 oranges. They're 8 fruits. And he was always going around the house putting things together to make more. And when people asked him, he said, I just like to put things together and make more. And they thought that was a little bit strange. Now the next brother, dressed always in yellow or gold. He had gold on his hat, gold on his shirt, He even had golden shoes. And on his chest and on his hat, he had this strange embroidered design. Yes, he also liked to put things together to make more, but he said, I can do it faster than my older brother. I know how to do it because I take the same thing over and over. 3 apples, 3 apples, 3 apples, and 3 apples. I'll take all these threes. I've got 12 apples. 2 berries, 2 berries, 2 berries, 6 berries. 7 needles, 7 needles, 7 needles, 7 needles. I took 28 needles and put them all in a pile from my mother's sewing kit, faster than my brother could do it. I can do what he does. I just repeat it faster and faster. He was very proud of his ability to go more quickly. But he still kind of did the same thing as his older brother. But not the third brother. There was a third brother who dressed completely and totally in green. Oh yes, he had a green shirt, a green hat, and he even wore green shoes. And on his chest and on his hat, he wore this embroidered picture that you see in front of you. Yes, he had this embroidered on him and printed on all of his clothing. And he was kind of a troublesome character because he liked to take things away. While his 2 older brothers were putting things together, he'd go to their pile and say, my older brother had 7. I'm going to take 4 away and just leave 3. My middle brother had 28 needles, remember? I'll take away 22 of them, and there'll only be 6 left. My brother had 5, and I take away 3, and I hide them. I like to take things away and leave less. I always take things away to leave less. Sometimes I may even take everything. Like that pile of oranges that had 7 oranges. I'll take all 7, and there's nothing left. What a troublesome person he was. He caused so many problems for his older brothers. They liked to put things together, he took them apart. But there was a 4th brother who dressed completely in blue. He had a blue shirt, he had a blue hat, and you know what else he had that was blue, don't you? He had blue what? Shoes. And on his chest, he had sewn this design that was so special, and it was on his hat too, in blue. And he thought that he was the fairest of all the brothers because he liked to pass things out to everyone so everyone got a fair share. So if he had 7 apples, he would give 1 to you, 1 to you, 1 to you, 1 to you, until all of his 7 friends had exactly the same thing. But if he had 14 apples, each of those friends would get 2. And for his 3 older brothers, if he had 6 beads, each brother would get 1 and 1 and 1, and then he'd look and he'd have more and he'd give 1 and 1 and 1 until they all had the same. Yeah, he was fair. He thought this is the way to be. Fair. Well, one day in the village nearby there was a great storm. A windstorm blew up, and the winds blew through an orchard which they had golden apples growing in that orchard. And the apples could not, they were blown down from the trees. They lay all over the ground in a great clutter and a mess. And the first brother came up, because all 4 brothers looked at it, and the first brother came up and said, I know what I can do. I'll put those apples together to make piles. I'll put them together to make more. And he did it. He took 3 apples and 4 apples and 5 apples and put them all together in a pile. He took 7 apples and 1 apple and made a pile of 8. He took 4 apples and 4 apples and made another pile of 8. He took 6 apples, 3 apples, and made a pile of 9. And that's the way he spent his time, going around the orchard, piling up the apples to make them neat. But his second brother, remember the one in gold? You remember he said, I can put things together, but I repeat what my older brother did, and I do it even faster. And then the older brother interrupted and said, but I'm putting things together to make more, and I have a name for that. I'm going to name that addition. And addition means putting things together to make more. And the second brother said, well, I have a name for what I do too. Because when I take 6 and 6 and 6 and 6, I'm doing the same thing, but I'm doing it much faster. I call it multiplication. That's putting things together by repeating your addition. I can do it so quickly. He was kind of almost arrogant about it, but he was still a pleasant person. Now the third brother, of course, remember him? He's the one that was such a problem. He liked to take things away, and he did exactly that. He went to the neat piles that the older 2 brothers had started to build, and he'd say, there are 4 apples, I'll take 2 of them away. And he'd go somewhere else with them. Here are 3 apples, I'll take 1 away. There were 28 apples, I'll take 5 away. And he kept taking the piles apart, and you know what he called it? He called it subtracting. He said, I'm doing subtraction. And subtraction means taking things away to leave less. Whenever I take things away, there are fewer apples left than there were before. But since there were 2 brothers building the piles up, and only one taking them away, eventually all of the apples were in neat piles. And then the 4th brother stepped in and he said, I can solve the problem here. I know what to do. Now, meanwhile, the villagers had been standing around in wonderment, looking at this crazy activity that the brothers were doing. But everybody liked the 4th brother, and he started to go to the piles, and he said, I'm going to distribute these apples equally, so everybody gets a share. And he started handing out apples, 1 to you, 1 to you, 1 to you. And when everybody had an apple, he went back to the pile and started again. And he did that over and over and over again until every single person had the same number of apples. And he said, this we call division. Division is the fairest of the 4 operations that we do. My eldest brother showed us putting things together to make more. He showed us addition. Then my next brother showed us repeating the addition to go even faster, and he called that multiplication. Then we had my subtracting brother who took things away, and finally I passed things out equally. And the townspeople looked at the 4 brothers and cheered. And from that time on, those 4 things, addition, multiplication, subtraction, and division, were honored, and they live on to this very day. And I think they always will. And you know what? That is a true story. Or if not, it should be. And that's the end of that story. Let's talk a little bit about, and I hope you liked it. I hope you like that story. The children love it. And when I tell that story, I have these symbols mounted on cards that I can show the children. So I bring up a 8.5 by 11 card that has these different symbols, and I show them to the children. Now, this is your turn. You people that are all sitting out there having listened to me, I want you to think about, what does this story do? What do you think it accomplishes? Go ahead and write in so Tim can read to me what you're thinking. Do you think that it helps children be engaged with math? Do you think it helps them become fascinated or have something to carry away? Does it give them a model onto which they can attach the idea of addition or the idea of division and so on? Does it give them something they can carry away in more than just a left brain model, but incorporates the whole, both sides of the brain? Or is it just fluff? What do you think? Tim, are we getting any answers?
We are beginning to. First off, I want to apologize to everybody. When Michael and I set up for this week, we did not go in and check the homework, the handouts. And so all of you are looking and seeing last week's handouts. And if you weren't with us last week, please take them with our you're welcome to them. But there was no handout that Michael you've given us for this week. Here's what we have so far. Uh, we have a question that came in a little bit earlier from Salma. Salma Korokhan. And Salma, I'm curious where you're at right now, what part of the world. The question is, in this digital age, what is the best way of storytelling?
What is the best way of sharing what? I'm sorry, Tim. Say that again.
Basically, what she's asked, and this is earlier in your conversation. I want to share it. She's saying, in a digital age, where kids are used to TV and iPads and whatever, what's the best way of storytelling? I think
Okay.
we just demonstrated it, but I wanted to bring that forward in case you had other thoughts.
That's a really good question, and it's one that I hear a lot. And it is sort of in today's culture, what has changed? What changes that call us to make storytelling? And of course, we can refer to things that are inventions of our current culture, but the best way to tell stories is still the same way. See, the thing is, well, culture and our accoutrement of culture, the things around us, like the computer that I'm looking at right now, those things are new inventions. But the human mind is not a new invention. The human mind still is the mind that carries its cultural heritage from 60,000 years ago. So the best way to tell stories is still, like it always has been, to be directly telling them to the children with eye contact, with gesture, with direct one-to-one interaction. It's it's the talking to them, the gesturing to them, the carrying this forward with relationship, with developing that relationship. It works today. It's still, believe me, it still works. So I'd still say it's the best way now. Some people refer to other things as storytelling. Like they might say that a journalist is a storyteller, or that a director like Woody Allen is a storyteller, or that um, an actor is a great, or somebody like that is a great storyteller. Those are different meanings of the word storytelling. The kind of storytelling I'm talking about is best communicated just as we did. Except if I had my favorite way to do it, I'd see your faces looking back at me. That's the thing that's missing here. By the way, I have to apologize. There's some sound going on in the background because unfortunately somebody started a construction project next door, and so if that's a noise that comes in, I apologize for that. Tim, are we getting any ideas on what the story does for them? Are you able to hear me? Uh-oh. I don't know if people are hearing me or not. Um, Suddenly, I'm not seeing Tim at all anymore.
Yes, Michael. I all of a sudden our internet started acting wonky, and hopefully it didn't affect the recording. So I had to turn off my monitor, or excuse me, my camera. Um, so Michael, let me just. You were saying some things that I lost as well, and I understand, by the way, that people are saying my voice is very soft. Are you hearing me okay, Michael?
I'm hearing you well, yes.
Okay. One of the things that I would mention about what you just said, Michael, about the human brain hasn't changed, is that's a good point to remember in another context separate from storytelling. And that is when somebody says, well, Maria Montessori worked 100 years ago and the world is different. The human brain, the way children develop, has not changed. There's no question that digital technology is a major factor that our young children are experiencing it, but we're still dealing with children. They still respond to tactile experience, hands-on experience, and they respond to stories, and they respond to relationships. And the best thing about being in Montessori is you don't have to sit still all day. You form really deep partnerships and friendships with your teachers and fellow students. And you can work with your hands, and there are great stories. Nothing has really changed that's important when it comes to the nature of how humans are. The other thing I want to say before I feed comments to you, Michael, is just to reiterate the importance of what you're talking about. Storytelling may, to some people listening, seem like an add-on to Montessori, and it is not. And I know Michael said it, but I want to reiterate. Montessori designed the program so that we tell stories quite a bit. And especially at elementary, many of the things we do are done with stories, but also at early childhood. And the art that Michael is speaking about is something that he has noticed, I have noticed, many of you have noticed, has become neglected in Montessori teacher development. Some teachers really understand it and still practice it. Michael is attempting to really emphasize its value. You agree, Michael?
Thank you, Tim. Yes, that's well put.
So let's go on with a few comments. They're pretty simple, Michael. Emma says, you're brilliant. Patricia says, this makes math fun. Emma goes back and says, this really helped me associate the colors with the symbols. Mary Anderson says, this empowers children because they already are familiar with the operations. It gives them a reverence for the processes of math. Absolutely, Mary. Marcy, let's see if I'm pronouncing this right. Marcy Prochaska. I think I've got that right, Marcy. I hope, and please forgive me if I mangle the pronunciation. She says, Michael, it does give a conceptual understanding of what the operations are. The only thing that gave me pause is the negativity around subtraction. No pun intended. That's a good one. Puns are good. Michael, do you want to say anything about the negativity?
I was going to jump on the pun aspect too. Adding a negative number to a positive, of course, turns into a subtraction act. You know, you can play that how you like it. It's kind of interesting for stories to have a conflict in them. And the conflict isn't evil. It's just, there is basically a conflict between the additive functions, addition and multiplication, and the subtractive function. And those are different. And to emphasize their difference, I brought in that, I don't think of it as negative, but I brought in that, gee, he's a problem. He does these things, and the others saw him that way. You don't have to put that part in if that concerns you. And that's another thing about stories. There is this thing they call the folk process that implies that as folk arts are passed from generation to generation, from person to person, from family to family, they grow and are altered, and that's okay. And that applies to stories like this too. So that as you grow the story and you tell it, it will become yours. And that may mean you'll change that particular aspect. And you have my permission.
There you go. Some comments. First up, Marcy says, "Yup, I pronounced her name correctly. Thank you, Marcy." Donna Wilden says, "This is very engaging." Patricia says, we are still the same human race and we still learn through our senses. I love listening to stories and it's still effective and fun. Big smile. Julia Rome says, Michael's voice is much more clear than mine. By the way, I can't seem to download the handouts for the past few weeks. It's probably my computer, but is there another site where you can download them from? Yes, indeed. Julia, these webinars are free, but they're sponsored by the Montessori Foundation and its membership organization, the International Montessori Council. If you're not a member of the International Montessori Council, I really encourage you to go to montessori.org and look at all the benefits of being a member. It's not like belonging to AMI or AMS. It has nothing to do with where you were trained. It's simply a professional society. You might think of it as being like NAMTA. It's just different. It has a different voice, and this is an example of one of the many things that make us different. The recordings are a small part of the members' library. So that's where you can get the recording. It usually takes about a week before we get them uploaded. Joe Campbell up in, I believe, Maine. Michael, your story makes a real impression. Irene Morales says, Michael, I just ordered your book yesterday through the Montessori Services website. By the way, for those of you who might be confused, Parent Child Press was sold to Montessori Services when Aileen Wolf, the original founder, decided that she wanted to retire. So the work carries on, and when you want to order something from Parent Child Press, either look up Parent Child Press and it takes you right to the Montessori Services website, or go to Montessori Services website. Laura. Laura says, I'm Laura White. Oh, I see. I love this story, and I definitely know the children will relate with it well to it and remember all the operations, what their purposes are. I know that they'll tell the story themselves, and I think you're absolutely right.
They will do that. And sorry to cut you off there, Tim, but I want to jump on that idea from Laura. You're right. They will do that, and they should do that. That's a great thing when they do it, and they then will make it their own. See, it becomes not just a story, but part of me or the child. So I'm going to go on because
No, Michael, you can't. I
yeah,
actually went to the bottom and started working up, and Amanda C, and I suspect that's Amanda Cunningham. She has written something you got to hear. She says, I don't feel like I'm a good storyteller. I'm kind of boring. How do I get better at this?
I'm going to get into that, Amanda. First of all, I don't believe that you're boring. Uh, Even when we think of that in ourselves, the smallest incidents in our own lives can give you the genesis for a good story. And I want to talk about that more as we go ahead. Um, Look, you don't have to start by writing a story like the Four Strange Brothers. You can get that story, you can learn that story, and you can tell that story. But eventually, you're going to want to write your own. And we're going to talk about that later. I don't want to go over it right now. But you know what? I'm getting a lot of interference. Think that you are probably as boring as you're saying. But you can go ahead and try this story. Here's what I found out, and I've done a lot of in-services at schools. I go to schools, I meet with faculties, I meet with teachers, I go in classrooms and I model storytelling with the children, and I find out often that teachers are afraid. They're afraid. They say, oh, but I can't do that. Michael, you have a gift. Well, the truth is, you can begin to do it. Yes, it is an art form, but it is an incredibly accessible art form. But you're not going to get there unless you just sort of try it. And go ahead and do it. We're going to talk about how to do it in a while. Um, but I have faith in you, Laura, that you're able to do this. And I want to hear back from you in a few weeks or months or sometime with a success story. And so that's your assignment, to give me that if you can. Go ahead, Tim. Can I jump forward or? Uh-oh, we may have lost Tim.
No, you didn't lose me. I was muted because there's things happening around me, and you heard it as static. Um, Norma has Norma Mel. I'm sure I'm pronouncing this wrong. Norma, please forgive me. Norma Melgarejo says, I've got to tell you, Michael, this is wonderful, and your storytelling book includes many stories that are similar. And you know, and oh, I'm sorry, she's asking whether it includes similar examples, and if so, please let us know the book's name. The book's name is The Deep Well of Time. I just sent out to everybody the link to where you can order the book from Parent Child Press.
Right, right. Yes, the book does contain almost 50 stories like this. And if the book ends up being successful and people like it, I have another 45 or so stories already that we could incorporate into a sequel at some point. But let's deal with these first and get these first stories done. And most of all, get past the fear factor and get past the embarrassment factor and just go ahead and do it. You'll never have as receptive and positive an audience as that group of children. They will absolutely love it that you're doing exactly this. Now, let me say a couple things about this story before I go on. When I wrote The Four Strange Brothers, you will notice I purposely incorporated the traditional Montessori colors as identifying the four brothers. I purposely incorporated the symbols, the plus sign, the minus sign, and so on. I wanted the children to carry away the idea that addition means putting things together and making more. That's a foundational idea of what it is. And so each of the four operations, I wanted them to carry away something that essentially they'll memorize and they'll be able to say later when we bring out the stamp game, for instance. I could say, who remembers what does addition mean? Oh, I do. It means when you put things together, you get more. Yeah. All right, we're going to do that now. So starting from that basic understanding, that's like holism. We're looking at the whole thing. Now we can deal with the detail of what's 5 plus 7. But I know it's going to be more. It's going to end up with something bigger. See? That's what stories can do for us. Well, let's take a look at some things that come up all the time. These are some questions I get. Is this a true story? That's a really big question. My own grandchildren ask me that. Grandpa, is this true? No story that I ever tell or that anybody ever tells would work if there weren't elements of truth in it. So in this story that I just told, it talks about brothers. Well, there are such things as brothers. It talks about a village. There actually are villages. There actually are apples. There actually is addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. So those things are true. But the story itself takes those truths and fictionalizes them. So it makes them into fiction. But fiction works because it's based on truth. So when I talk to children, I say, well, you know, all stories have some truth in them. That's what makes them work. And I don't want with the children to draw a line between truth and false or something like that. I don't want to do that. Because I think that they need to see that all stories are ways of transmitting truths. But sometimes they speak to us in ways that direct instruction doesn't. They help us understand truths in other ways. And that's one of the many powers of stories. There are two kinds of lessons in Montessori, particularly in the elementary, and those two lessons I name technical lessons and psychological lessons. A technical lesson is a lesson that emphasizes technique, hence the name technical. For example, building the pink tower has a particular technique. You start with the largest cube, it goes up and you end up with a small one. You've got a tower when you're done. There's a technique to it. If I'm going to work with the dot board, there's a particular way that you do it. You take a pen, you make dots, and so on. Most of our lessons are technical, and they deal with the technical aspects of everything that we do. A psychological lesson is a different kind of lesson. It tries to approach the right brain of children. It tries to approach the imaginative, creative side of children. There are fewer of those, but they're more powerful. And it's like, because I like to eat, I compare this to a dinner. At the dinner table, you may have your basic foods, and you may also have herbs and spices. The herbs and spices bring life to the food. They make it have a unique and piquant taste, a special flavor, right? But you're not going to live on a diet of nothing but oregano. You add a little bit of that or cloves to bring out something. That is the equivalent of the psychological lesson. It is the herb, the spice, the thing that makes those technical lessons bloom. It's not that one is good and the other is bad. You need both. But too often, schools ignore the psychological part for the technical. And then they become overly didactic. And you know what? That's what's wrong with a lot of schools. I'm not pointing my finger at any particular school. But if it's dry as dust, we need to bring some life to it. And that's what stories can do. The gift of the memorable I've already talked about, so I won't do it again. But I will talk about when should stories be offered. Because people ask me. And these are the times, I think. First of all, stories are really good to give at the beginning of a unit or a chapter or a lesson or whatever you call these chunks of things. When I took my Montessori training in Europe, they called things chapters. So we might have the chapter about the golden beads, for instance, the chapter of addition, the chapter of the verb, and on and on. But some people call that just the area of study. But if we're going to look at the functions of words at the beginning of the study of the noun, great time for a story. When we begin to look at the family of the noun, that's another good time for a story. We begin to look at the verb and its family, another good time for a story. So launching these new things, and that's because stories give motivation, they give excitement, they give insight, so that then you can go to the technical aspects with these embedded within you. Now, they're also good to do at the end of that study. So now we've done everything we're going to be doing with the noun. Let's go back and look at that story again. And we see it now in the light of the technical things we've learned. Some very, very few stories should be given at specific times in the year. And those particularly are a set of stories we call the great lessons, which we'll get to. And those typically, I believe, should be given as early in the year as possible, because what they launch is the entire field of study for the whole program. But most stories should be given at the beginning and again at the ending of something that we're looking at. Now, storyteller. Can I tell you, please, it needs to be you. The story, it's wonderful for you to bring in a professional storyteller sometime. It's a good thing. And you can bring in storytellers that tell stories from their cultural background. A Native American story, an African American story, stories that are Irish in background, stories that have a Romani background. These are all wonderful things, but you need to be the prime storyteller in your classroom, because it's a relationship building thing that ties that knot of relationship between that spiritual tie that I talked about between you and the children. You can't pass that off to somebody else. When you bring in that Navajo storyteller, that person that comes to tell those stories is a wonderful person, but is not going to build that 3-year long-term relationship that you can do. So you are the storyteller. You need to be that person. And finally, let me end up with myth and truth, because that's a consideration people come up with. You know, this is particularly irksome to me because today we hear people talk about myths as if they're falsehoods. This is a myth in advertising, or here's a myth about nutrition, or a myth about whatever. But actually that's a misuse of the word. Myth actually goes back to meaning a sacred story. So embedding stories in the sense of myth gives them this dignity, and they actually contain truth, but truth in a way that reaches us differently than everyday didactic knowledge. So when these considerations come up, and they will, maybe this will help you in dealing with them. So I wanted to talk about truth and fact, and I have. Now, fiction, fantasy, and imagination are hot button items for a lot of Montessorians. Fantasy, oh, we don't want to do that. And sometimes they link that with imagination or fiction. Let me say, all of us either want to or should want to do imagination. But one kind of imagination is fantasy. But you will find fantasy, no matter what you think about it for early childhood and so on, is a part of what we want to bring in with older children. We want to bring in the fantastic. But fiction is different. So if I tell a story that says there was once an egg, and deep inside that egg, in the darkness, in the moisture, there suddenly was movement. And that movement was the movement of life. And the chick was in there. And that chick began to peck. I don't know why she pecked. She had some reason, a need to start pecking at the shell. Now I can go on and tell that story of the chick breaking out of the shell, and that's a fictional story because I made it up, but it's realistic, and that's different from fantasy, you see? So fiction is a made-up thing, but it has a realistic basis, and we want to use fiction a lot in what we do. Now, I want you to tell different kinds of stories to different age groups. For infants, if you're in an infant class, what we want to do with them is tell them the ongoing story of what's going on around them. If we have the infant on our chest or on our back, we should be talking continually about what's going on. Sweetheart, we're in the grocery store right now. We're looking at green peppers. I love green peppers. I wonder which pepper I'm going to choose. Oh, this one looks really good. People may look at you strangely and think you're just talking away to nobody, but that is the story of what's happening around us. The story that's what infants need, is this kind of, they don't need fantasy or fiction. They don't know what's truth and fact. They have an absorbent mind that's an unconscious absorbent mind, and we can help them put words to the impressions that surround them. Now, as we get into toddlers and children's house, we can start getting into stories that are based in fact and fiction. Good factual stories are stories at this level about yourself. When I was a small boy, let me tell you something that happened. That kind of story. And a fictional story might be like the chick breaking out of the egg that I just talked about. But those all have a realistic basis. As we move into the elementary and beyond, we want to expand our stories into using very expanded ideas of imagination, and we may even involve legend, mythology, fantasy, fairy tales, expand them away from just reality. So we're going to go into other areas. So you'll notice we start with what's going on around us with the infants. We expand to things that happen in the real world around us, though we may not be present at that time. We're not in the egg with the chick. And then we expand to things we can imagine. And with that, we have the entire universe at our disposal. So that's the plan of stories for the Montessori classroom. In this book, I've identified 7 kinds of stories: great lessons, curriculum stories, origin stories, biographical histories, personal stories, character development, and creative dramatics. I'm going to talk about each one of those. I want you to think about those 7 kinds. But there are many other story types that we could talk about. Narratives are one of the most common story types that we will use. I'll talk about those. Those are like telling a story without a plot or without characters. They're mini stories, they're myths, legends. All of these other kinds of stories are different. I see I got character development twice, but all of these other kinds of stories are really valuable. It's just that in the book I just focused on 7 kinds because it's already almost 400 pages, so I could write another 390-page book if we were going to deal with these. And some people, like Joseph Campbell, have written volume after volume just on one of these categories, which is myth. So it's a very powerful area. Now, I told you I'd talk about each one of these categories: great lessons, then curriculum stories, and so on. Let's talk about great lessons. There are 5 big themes in the elementary. And those, so it's a thematic program. And the themes are the universe, living things, humanity, language, and math. And for each of those, there's a story and a lesson that goes with it. And these are those 5. The story of the universe, the coming of life, coming of humans, story of language, and story of math. I've done a couple of webinars here with Tim about specifically just these great lessons. So I'm not going to do that now. In the book, each one of these is written out so that you can follow a text, if you'd like, for each of these 5 great lessons. But don't read it, remember. Just tell the stories. And for the great lessons, I would suggest you don't give them follow-up work. Just tell the story. Let the story come to life. The reason you want to avoid the follow-up work is because, particularly as children enter a little more maturity, they start to think as you're telling the story, but what am I going to have to do? What is she going to ask me to do? What will I have to do? Maybe you remember that from being a student yourself and thinking, what's going to be on the test? What am I going to have to know? What is expected of me? And we don't want them to think like that. We don't want that thought to enter in. We want them to lose themselves in the story. Because these are magnificent stories. They're wonderful stories. I did not write these stories, and either did Maria Montessori. These stories belong to humanity. As long as we know, people have been telling stories to answer questions like, how did we get here? Why am I here? What's my purpose? What happened before me? And what's going to happen? How did we get these gifts of talking and being and sharing? These lessons address those. So they're human questions, but they're awfully important questions. That's the first set of stories, and because they're so big, I'm not going to devote any more time to them now, but we will come back, I'm sure, in the fall and have a webinar or two again specifically on the great lessons, because they're such a big, big topic. Okay? Let's talk a little about curriculum stories then. Curriculum stories, that's a term I made up. And a curriculum story I wrote in the book. I said a curriculum story is like a gift to the children in the classroom. Most of the stories in the elementary classes will end up to be of the curricular type. So a curriculum story is a story specifically hooked, linked, tied to something in the curriculum, like the Four Strange Brothers. That's not a fairy tale. It's not a myth, though it's told as if it were a legend or a folk tale, but it isn't really. It's actually a story specifically written to link to something in the Montessori curriculum. So if you think of something in the Montessori curriculum, like I mentioned maybe the pronoun, we could write a story about that. Or particularly a story about the discovery and taming of fire. We could write a story about that. Or something like, how did soap come to be? So anything that we have that's in our curriculum that we're regularly teaching, we could write a story about it. And these areas that I listed here, arithmetic, science, geography, geometry, history, language, and the arts, are traditionally thought of as the core subject areas for the elementary school, for Montessori. We can write stories that tie to each of these 7 areas. So when we're within geography, or we're within geometry, or within language, we can create stories for each of those. And if we do, those are curriculum stories. Now, there are books out that have been well received that talk about using stories to teach, well, for example, science. I just got one from Great Britain that's about using storytelling to teach science. But what they're doing is they're taking traditional folk tales, traditional stories, that may be something like the story of Icarus. You may remember the Greek myth of Icarus, who flew too high and supposedly his wings melted and he fell to the ground. And using that story as a launching pad for something about aviation. Okay, well, that's a different thing. What I'm talking about is crafting a specific story particularly for our curriculum areas. That's one of the most important things that I have been working on with this book, and that I hope you do too. I like this quote by Kipling. If history were taught in the form of stories, it would never be forgotten. I think he's right, but I'd like to expand that. If arithmetic, if geography, if history, if language, if any of these subjects were taught, I'd say the same thing. They would never be forgotten. What a power. A little bit more, I think they are kind of unique to Montessori. Each curriculum story is hooked up to a particular concept or a lesson or a unit or a chapter, or they may be linked to a particular piece of material. So you'll see in the book, for example, there's a story that's particularly linked to the bead cabinet. There's a story that's particularly linked to that box of materials that's called the detective triangle material. So some stories are linked to specific materials because the materials are tied to our curriculum. These are why you should use curriculum stories. They are so important in their inspiration, their animation, they invigorate, they're motivating to the children. They're powerful ways to involve both sides of the brain, and they help balance the curriculum between the technical on the one hand and the psychological on the other hand. So they help keep us in a nice, honest balance. If you don't use stories, curriculum stories, you have this tendency to become dry. You may remember, I said a while ago, When I first started in the elementary classroom, when I had studied elementary in the early 1980s and late 70s, I didn't like stories. I didn't think they did any of these things. I thought they were purely entertainment. They were the Mickey Mouse piece of the classroom. A waste of time. And was I ever wrong? Because they actually do all of these wonderful things. And you know how I found out? I got to certain places in the curriculum where a story had been told to us in training, oh, you should have a story here. And often in training, they said, you should have a story, but they didn't give us any story. They just said, you should have a story. All right, I'll do a story here, even though it may seem silly. But even the silliest stories struck a chord with the children. And so I had to readjust my attitude. And now I know this is why we should use curriculum stories. They work. Before I get into this one, I'm going to tell you another story. This is a curriculum story about pronouns called the rebellious pronoun. Before I tell you that story, I'm going to say to Tim, so you can unmute yourself, Tim, and tell me if there are other things, questions, or thoughts or ideas that I should respond to before I tell a second story.
Fair enough, Michael. Let's just take a look. We've got lots of things that are happening. Patricia Delapane, I'm sorry, Patricia, says, I think I sent out to everyone that they should join the IMC, and I didn't realize sent out to everybody. And she says, it is worth it. Become an IMC member today. Smile. Thanks, Patricia. Really appreciate it. I agree. It's, I'm more than agree. I was one of the founders, but it's a great group. Donna Wilden says, here in Australia, there is a great emphasis on not only reading from books, but importantly, telling stories, encouraging the children to participate in the stories as the characters, as the storytellers. It's a good point, and it is, of course, part of your tradition as a country. Amanda says to you, Michael, I'll let you know how it works out, Michael. He goes on to say, is there a source for more of the stories that Montessori or Mario might have told other than the standard ones?
I don't think so. That's one of the reasons I started to write stories down, was that people would ask me, where do I find this in writing? For example, one of the first stories I told ever in my life in the classroom is a story that was called in my training course, The Love Story of the Lines. Not lions, but L-I-N-E-S. A love story. It's a geometry story of lines. And it's actually a story about convergent, parallel, and divergent lines. But where was that written down? Well, it's told in a lot of training courses in a lot of different ways. And it has its origin, nobody knows for sure where, but it goes back probably to Mario Montessori himself. But we don't know that for sure. So somewhere there needed to be a source that people could look at. And when I wrote the stories down, I take responsibility for any alterations or change because that's the folk process. And you may have heard them in training in a different way, but, well, that's the way it is. But no, there isn't really a book that I could turn to that has sources like this. So when I did workshops at schools and so on, people were often asking, but Michael, that was a good story. I couldn't write it fast enough. Where can I get the source? That gap, that void, is what I hope that we can be addressing now. Okay?
Yep. Amanda goes on to write, we're all aware of the great lessons of a few of the add-on stories. Otherwise, the kind of storytelling is primarily left out of many of our trainings. And Amanda, that is absolutely true. The reason why that's true is for the most part, once the American Montessori Society really got going, they they followed a model that assumed that a year of student teaching and a relatively short but intensive summer institute would be enough, and especially at elementary, even with a full summer and quite often big chunk of the second summer, it just isn't enough time. And in the AMI tradition, there wasn't traditionally the student teaching requirement, or it was much shorter, but there was time enough and a requirement that everyone do the same thing. In other words, the trainers were taught, don't leave this out. And so while there is variation in all organizations, AMI tends to be more comprehensive in covering all the tradition of Montessori, and it's one of their great strengths. And the other thing to remember is AMI originally followed an oral tradition. You couldn't buy a book that had most of what you learned in training. You had to hand write it. And that wasn't just because Maria Montessori hand translated, you know, the work of Itard and Séguin from French to Italian. It was also because, one, it was expensive to publish things in small quantity, and secondly, it was a way of both ensuring that the students really were understanding what was taught, and it was also a way of avoiding it being spread out in the world in a way that people could just read a book and think they knew Montessori. And so people like Michael and Harvey Hallenberg and many of the other trainers have been keeping this legacy alive, and that's why the book is so important.
Well, I think it's all good, Tim, and also it has just been that often in training we were given, at least I was in my training, and I have the elementary training from both the AMS and the AMI, and we were often given little teasers like, this would be a good place to have a story, or, you know, this letter A and B go back to a meaning of an ox in a house. You could write a story about the ox in the house, and that would be the story. So if you didn't pursue that, if you didn't go ahead and create those stories, or even if it were created, if you didn't go ahead and practice it and try it out, maybe it just didn't get communicated on. So I think, yeah, a lot of training courses may not have been able to do that, but I'm hoping to see stories infuse what we do in Montessori as we go forward.
That's a good point. One last thing, Nancy Chattel has pointed out that in the IMC members library, she said she's not finding any of the webinars from you since May. I'm almost certain that they have been uploaded and are in there, but I will go in, Nancy, and I'll double check. I will periodically get so overwhelmed with work that I may let it slip for a week or so, but I don't think that this is correct. What's more likely is I might not have saved them with the right tag, and so you may not be spotting them when you go in and you look for them as webinars. I'll do that right after this webinar ends.
Thank you, Tim. That's great, and thank you for bringing that up, Nancy. Nancy, I hope that I will see you at the Regional Montessori Conference in La Crosse, Wisconsin this year, as I did last year. I'm going to be presenting two lengthy workshops about stories, one aimed at preschool, infants, toddlers, and 3 to 6-year-olds, and one aimed at elementary. So hopefully I'll be able to see you there and answer direct questions at that time. By the way, our own colleague, Kathy Leach, is doing the keynote at that particular conference. So that'll be fun for all of us as well.
That's right.
Well, you know that I'm going to start the story. So you see the symbol of the well indicates that I'm about to tell a story. I would turn my back. Typically, I would take a breath and I'd try to get into the mood. And then I would give my little signal, which would be, for example, my little ding of the bell, and I would turn and begin the story. You all have learned that the head of the noun family, the king of the nouns, is the noun itself. It's true. The noun is the rightful ruler of his whole family. The noun names everything. The noun has the biggest vocabulary of any of the parts of speech. Every single name of everything is named by the noun. The noun is the emperor or king and has the right to name every person. The noun, like me, the noun has the right to name every place, like St. Paul, where I live. The noun names every single thing, like the table upon which I work. The noun can name every single feeling, like love or anger. The noun can even name ideas, like childhood or democracy. Oh, the noun has a big vocabulary and is very proud of that, and stands with great pride at the head of his family. But in the family of the noun there was a prince. Yes, there was a prince, the pronoun. And the pronoun said, I can do everything you can do, but I can do it better. While you have to have the name of every single child in this classroom, I can just get by with him or her. And I can use he or she. And with those few words, I don't need to name all the people. You see how much better it is. And the noun, of course, didn't like to hear this. And then the pronoun said, I can name everything. It. That's all I need. You say table. You say computer. You say house. You say wall. You say screen. You say finger. I just say it. I can do so much better. I can name all the feelings and ideas with only a few words. And meanwhile, the pronoun was trying to stand tall, up above its rightful ruler, to raise itself taller, to be even taller than the noun, and filled with pride. But this didn't work, for in the long run, the king, the noun, ejected the pronoun from his family, and the pronoun no longer is a member of the family of the noun. In fact, the pronoun went over to join the verb and is now a member of the family of the verb, where he's well appreciated and has his place. But still, he turned purple with rage at the thought of the noun being above him. And as we learn about the pronoun, we'll learn about how he works with the noun, with the verb now, and the new role that he's taken now that he's no longer a part of the family of the noun. It's a lesson for all of us to learn. Now, that's the quick story, and you'll notice how much faster that story was than the story I told about the four strange brothers. And in telling this story, I wanted to think about the fact that we have the families categorized. The noun family has the article, adjective, and noun, and the verb family has the verb, the adverb, and the pronoun. Well, how did the pronoun get into the verb family? Why is it over there? Why does it serve the, it's said to serve the verb? The story is a fanciful way of putting it there, but putting it in the mind of the child that the pronoun is supplanting the noun. It wants to replace the noun, and it does. And for that reason, it's in the verb family. And then when we do conjugations, I am, you are, he, she, it is, we are, you, plural, you are, they are, we always link the pronoun with the verb. So that's where the pronoun suddenly is found tied in with the verb. Oh, that's because it's part of the verb family. So I want you to think about what this story did, and I'm not going to take a long time and pause on this one as I did on the other one, but I want you to think, did the story give children some motivation to think about the verb? I'm sorry, about the pronoun. Did the story give them some motivation to think about the noun? Did it give them some thoughts about what are these two families and why are they considered two different families? And by that, as we consider that, there are also some parts of speech that don't belong to either family. And those are, where do they fit? Where does a conjunction fit? Or a preposition or an interjection? They're not in a family. So that begins a discussion. And whenever we begin a discussion, we're going beyond the didactic and we're going off into the creative. And that's what we want, really, because grammar can be really dry, and this brings some life to it. So this is the rebellious prince. He rebelled against his rightful ruler, the story says, and he became a member of the verbs family. Now, this is a fun story for children to act out, too. And there's a later story about the noun and the verb talking and meeting that's specifically aimed at creative dramatics to do this even more so. So I like the story because of what it does, and it's a curriculum story. Some people say, oh, but there's a conflict in there, and we don't like conflict. Well, then change it. But I haven't had that reaction from children. They kind of think it's interesting and to some extent funny, because the noun and the pronoun kind of are the same, but on the other hand, they're so darn different. That's the rebellious prince, the king and the pronoun, the king and the prince. Now, I want to talk a little about origin stories, but we're running out of time. So I'm going to talk about origin stories, and then the rest of our presentation will pick up, I think, next time, because with questions and so on. Origin stories are stories that tell the beginnings of all things. How did it come to be that? If you think of a kind of a mini story, an etymology is an origin story. If I talk about the etymology of the word cardinal, and we look at the bird, and we learn that the bird was named a cardinal because it was named after the churchman in the Roman Catholic Church who wore red. And people that saw the cardinal thought, oh, that bird is like a cardinal, and named it that. It helps us see the connection between things and the beginnings of the word. At the same time, I wrote a story called The Story of Soap. Where did soap come from? Here's how I wrote it. I thought, soap in Italian is sapone. Okay, maybe soap was discovered on Mount Sapone. I know that soap is made by the interaction of fat and lye. How could they have gotten that? So I wanted to deal with that. And I know soap makes things clean, so there'd be a benefit in discovering it. So the story says that there was a group of people who lived at the base, at the lower part of a mountain called Mount Sapone. And there was a fast-rushing stream right outside where they lived. Now, they lived in a cave, so they cooked their food outside. And what happened was as they roasted meats, drippings fell from the meat into the ashes. And when it rained, that became a mess, and they threw those ashes, they shouldn't have done it maybe, but often threw that into the pools of the stream. And they discovered that when they washed things in those pools, their clothes became cleaner. So that's the essence of what I wrote a story about. And that could be, we don't know, but it could be how soap was discovered. Someone discovered that ashes and fat, the lye and ashes and the fat together did what's called saponification, and they made soap. Wow, it probably was discovered by accident. That's an origin story. The great lessons are also origin stories, but they're so special that they get their own category. In non-Montessori fields, these are sometimes called why stories or pourquoi stories. It means why. Why do we do? Why, where, when, how, these stories. So Rudyard Kipling, for instance, wrote a whole book of that kind of fanciful stories. And our stories are less fanciful than stories of how the leopard got its spots or how the camel got its hump that he wrote. His stories still make good reading, but our stories try to think everything had a beginning. Everything had an origin. How did it happen? The origin of some of the most important things to us are unknown to us. We don't know, for example, really, who was the person or when was soap discovered or invented. We really don't know that. But we can speculate. And when we speculate, we can write a story about it. And that story can give an idea to children that does three things. It gives a possible origin. It actually explains the thing itself, that soap is made from these things, and it gives them a chance to actually act something out, or in the case of soap, to actually make it. One of my most vivid and stinky memories as a child was my grandma making soap. You actually can do this. So it gives you these things. Sometimes you can give origins of names, too. Most names have a beginning somewhere. Once upon a time, there was a fisherman who lived by the side of a great sea. Now, every day, he would throw his nets in the water, and he would bring in whatever he could catch. Sometimes it would be fish, sometimes shellfish, and once in a while, he would find an oyster. Now, it so happened back at home that his family began to grow, and his wife gave birth to a beautiful little girl. But they looked for inspiration as to what name should that child be given. And as he went out and threw his nets, luck, or maybe the gods, were with him, for he brought in an oyster. And when he opened it up, there was a pearl, and he thought, that is what I should name her. I should name her Pearl, in honor of this moment when I received this beautiful pearl, and I'll give her the pearl and the name. And he did. And that name, in Greek, became our name, Margaret. Margaret is a translation of that name, Pearl. The name was probably given to the first Margaret because of someone discovering a beautiful pearl in an oyster. Okay, so that's a story about a name that I made up. And that little story that you put together is based on fact that Margaret means pearl. Pearls are found in oysters. Oysters live in water. These things could have happened. So that's an origin story. Now, I still have to talk with you about a few more things, biographical histories and so on. But I'm not going to be able to get through all of these today because of our time, so I'm going to jump to the end and just say, this is the book I've been talking about. You can take a look at it. Tim has posted this connection for you. And if we have a few minutes, Tim, if you want to unmute yourself, if you have a few minutes, I will talk about answers to any questions that people have. And then we'll come back next week because I've got a lot more that I want to talk about with you. Okay, that's where we were, origin stories.
Hi, Michael. Basically, so far, no new questions. Emma said I just got my copy of the book ordered. I'm very excited to read it. So I'm looking to see if any of you have any questions you want Michael to address. There are still quite a few people that are online, so feel free. Michael has the time, and it just so happens my 2:30 appointment got rescheduled for next week, so I'm willing to sit here for a few more minutes if anyone has any questions.
And I'm willing to be here for a few more minutes, but not too long, Tim, because I have a 2 o'clock appointment and it's 1:42 in my time zone right now.
Right.
And it's probably 2:42 for you, correct?
Yes, correct. I'm
And
not,
if for some of you, like Linda Navan is there, you're in South Africa, it's probably the middle of the night for you, Linda.
yes, it must be about 10:30 for her, at least. Wait, let me think. It's probably 9:40. No, oh, okay, now things are coming in. Um, this is Gladys Salm. She just ordered the book from Parent Shop Press. Looking forward to reading it and looking forward to the webinar next week. Um, Patricia Delane says, thank you, Tim and Michael. Joe Can says, thank you, Michael. If you have the time, do you have any advice for a tired father who loves telling his girls bedtime stories?
Would you say that again, please, Tim? It's breaking up a little
Sure.
bit.
Sorry. Joe Campbell says, Michael, thank you. Do you have any advice for a tired father who loves telling his girls bedtime stories?
Yes, Joe. I'm glad you're on and that we're able to talk a little bit. And I think Tim said before you were from Maine, but I think actually California is correct, um, unless I'm wrong. Look, the stories that you can tell to your children at home, the stories I often tell. I'm getting a lot of interruption there from scratching or something that's coming in. What I tell are folk tales to a great extent. I look at folk tales and even traditional what are called fairy tales. So, for example, there's a lot of Russian folk tales about a character named Baba Yaga. And Baba Yaga is a witch, and she's fascinating to my grandchildren. She lives in a house that is on chicken legs, and various things happen around Baba Yaga, so I tell those stories. I tell stories that are more or less common fairy tales. It could be something like Goldilocks or the Three Pigs, but I am telling that story to them. I also tell them stories that we haven't gotten to yet in this about things that happened when I was young. And that can be often a very small story, but they're interested. Oh, because they've said to me even things like, Grandpa, when you were little, were there dinosaurs? And you may be giggling at that, but they don't really quite know because it seems like I'm so ancient to them that maybe I was around sort of butting shoulders with Tyrannosaurus Rex. So I like to tell them stories about things, and some of the things, indeed, when I was young, we didn't have an internet. When I was young, I happened to end up going to a one-room school, a one-room country school. So I can tell stories about myself, and some of the stories are really small things. Like one day I picked a watermelon and I came in from the garden and we dropped it and we broke it in the yard, and I made a little story about that. So little things like that make really good stories. You don't have to tell the story that's an entire novel. Don't try to become Robert Louis Stevenson and tell Treasure Island and make it up. Read that. That's a great book to read. That's a different thing. But you are you. And so you tell stories that fit with you. Maybe there's stories that you loved. So when you say you're a tired father, I don't want you to take ages to try to write a story from scratch. I want you to look in your own life, in your own history, and you have lived a life that has events in it. Talk about those events. And the children like to hear about that. They're always interested in those events. And it helps them understand kind of where you're coming from in a lot of ways. Okay? All right. Are there other questions or thoughts or comments?
Linda Devon says, thanks, guys. It's only 9:45 p.m. here in South Africa, but I've got the Montessori magazine, Child of the Universe, to publish tonight, and then I'll use the link that Tim, supplied and order the book. Be well. Gladys Salm says, how do I find information for becoming a member? How much is the individual membership? Gladys, you want to go to www.montessori.org and you want to look at the information for joining the International Montessori Council. In fact, let me give you the specific link for everyone. There's also a button at the top that says Join Now. And you can just do it. It costs $60 a year for an individual. The real benefits are for a school, which is $250. Most of our members are schools, but we do have teacher and individual members as well. And Joe says, thank you, and yes, that's me from California, Joe Campbell.
Good.
I think that's it, Michael. No one else has written in, so let's call it a day.
All right. Well, this has been really good. I hope we can be together again next week, and we'll take off next week by reviewing and then jumping into personal stories and going on from there. And I have a couple of stories still to tell you again next week.
All right. Thanks, Michael. Bye, everybody. This is Tim Selden from the Montessori Foundation, signing off for this week.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Okay.